welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to start with Stephen Lento, editor at alternativedata.org. We also have Joe Caserta on the line, who's going to be presenting about building an alternative data analytics platform. We're going to start with Stephen. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Remy, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Stephen Lento, and I'm an editor at alternativedata.org. Before I get started, some quick background on us. Alternativedata.org was founded with a very focused mission to help fundamental investors on the buy side get the best out of alternative data. We launched our platform last August, and it has grown very, very rapidly into a community of several thousand subscribers across buy-side investors, data providers, and infrastructure resources. So I'd like to start today by talking about the alternative data landscape. But first, just to take a step back, I want to just define alternative data for everyone who's less familiar. Broadly speaking, alternative data refers to any non-traditional source of information used in the investment process. So traditional sources are things like company filings, management presentations, press releases, all things that are essentially directly produced by the companies themselves. Things like credit card transaction data or web scrape data are examples of our alternative data, things that are not produced by companies, but help investors get a sense for individual company performance. And I'll get into a little bit more detail on these individual categories later on. One of the features of alternativedata.org's platform is that we track every alternative data provider and offer that to the buy side in a free database. So using this database, we did some analysis looking at the supply of alternative data sources. And as you can see from this chart, the acceleration in supply happened around 2009. And supply since that point has grown very rapidly. The growth inflection in this data supply actually mirrors the growth of more consumer-centric technology companies. So think about app businesses, things like mint.com, which makes sense given a good portion of alternative data actually directly comes from consumers. So from this chart, it's clear that supply has grown rapidly, but we also wanted to understand how the buy side was reacting to that growth in the supply of alternative data. So we undertook an analysis of full-time employees that are on the buy side working with alternative data. And I'll refer to this as alternative data FTEs or just data FTEs. So when we overlay the growth of FTEs, we can see that while the buy side was initially slower to react, the pace of growth has increased rapidly and now outpaces the growth in supply. And you can see sort of the inflection point on the supply side around 2009, the inflection point on the buy side in terms of FTEs around 2013. But very interesting that that pace of growth is much more rapid than the pace of growth on the supply side. So today, we'll get in a little bit more detail on alternative data landscape. And I really want to focus on three topics, and I'll hit these from a high level. We have a lot of great resources on our site, and I encourage you to check them out and subscribe so that you can get some more in-depth analysis on these topics. But I'd like to focus on three things for today. The first is structural changes that the buy side's making to react to alternative data. And this will focus primarily on our FTE analysis and how teams are being built, structured, and some of the backgrounds of those team members. Second, the performance of alternative data sets. And third, growth and demand for alternative data. And we'll visualize this in terms of buy-side spending. As I mentioned, our analysis on the subsequent slides features data from our FTE analysis, which we did in January, and our buy-side survey, which we very recently completed. So let's talk about structural changes on the buy side. As I mentioned, we did a deep dive analysis into the composition of alternative data FTEs. Our methodology leveraged LinkedIn primarily and our alternativedata.org network to find individuals that are focused on alternative data initiatives full-time. Through our process, we concluded that there's around 163 funds that employ a total of 340 alternative data FTEs. However, the methodology that we use has some limitations, suggesting that these numbers are actually quite low, and that there's probably significantly more data FTEs. And some of the examples of the limitations that we face in our methodology, various data FTEs are not on LinkedIn. People's titles don't always reflect their responsibilities or their focus. Most people don't highlight alternative data in their profiles, and then lastly, people don't update their LinkedIn profiles very often. But having said all this, once we completed our analysis, we investigated the different roles that comprise the alternative data FTE sample to understand its composition. What we found was that around 60% of current FTEs are in the data analyst or data scientist positions. These are also functions that have been growing the fastest. You can see in this chart that those functions, the data analyst, which is the dark blue line, data scientist, which is the light blue line, have been growing at roughly 3 times the rate of other position categories. What I think is interesting about this chart is you look at the period between 2005 and 2009, maybe 2010, most funds had just been hiring heads of data. So they'd pull somebody out of the investment team, they'd say, go figure out the data initiative. And for a while, it was just kind of that one person working with alternative data. And as data became more prevalent on the buy side, those heads of data started building out teams. And the first functions that they hired were data analysts. And then later, as they built out the team built out their bench, they hired more data scientists and data engineers to process all the data that they were consuming. So looking at our data set, it's really not just a hedge fund game when building out these teams. A lot of people say, this is a hedge fund game. We're long only, we don't use data. But looking at our data set, we were actually able to identify several long only funds that have built completely full data teams or have many alternative data FTEs. And some of these funds include Schroders, Fidelity, Capital Group, Neuberger, T. Rowe, and Invesco. So all very big funds and all have built out pretty deep benches in terms of alternative data. I think this is actually pretty amazing. When you think about the fact that alternative data has really only been prevalent for the past 7 years, and you think about how long onlys are structured, long only investors really, they experience much longer investment cycles than their hedge fund counterparts. They likely haven't seen the impact in terms of ROI of alternative data on their investment decision making. And so, we think of as long onlys get to see sort of the results of using alternative data in their investment decision making process, we'll see another huge influx of demand on the buy side as it expands out on the long only side. So we also looked at the types of backgrounds that data FTEs had. You can see in this chart that most functions have relatively high concentrations of STEM backgrounds, with the exception of heads of data, who are almost entirely from traditional investment backgrounds. We expect this to change over time. We expect that heads of data will diversify as data analysts and data scientists that have the more traditional STEM background progress into more leadership roles. We also looked at work experience, and what we found was that the majority of funds hired individuals with 11 plus years of experience. Very few funds are currently building out these data teams with recent college grads. That said, we believe that too will change over time as the alternative data skill set is, really only itself around 7 years old, as I mentioned. So, as the use cases for alternative data grow, we expect that funds will continue to invest more and more in hiring and training and retaining younger talent for roles on their data teams. We also expect a shift in terms of educational backgrounds. So when we compare the average educational background on the buy side to alternative data FTEs, The data FTEs have significantly more STEM degrees, but much fewer Ivy League and MBAs. And so as data becomes more of a focus for funds, this industry profile will change and skew, more towards the STEM background that alternative data FTEs are currently over-indexing in. And this will have a profound impact on recruiting, who will really need to adapt, given today they likely have few extensive networks for referrals for this type of alternative data skill set. So we also looked at the channels where these people are coming from. In 2012, most alternative data talent came from other funds or the sell side. If you flash forward to 2017, the sell side channel has remained largely the same, but sourcing from other funds has decreased substantially. And in fact, funds have increased their hiring from places like tech companies, academia, and data providers. And this, to me, really shows the demand for the alternative data skill set that recruiting from other funds is dropped significantly because there's so much demand for alternative data skills. They have to reach out from into other channels beyond the talent that exists today within the buy side. And we expect these channels to continue to diversify and grow as the industry seeks to fill the increasing demand for alternative data skill sets. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about performance. So this data will focus primarily on our buy side survey that I mentioned we recently completed. So in this slide, we asked funds what types of data that they're using. And what you can see here is that it's pretty diversified. Funds are using a mix. There isn't really a clear winner in terms of who's trying what. It's pretty diversified. I mean, email receipt, a little bit lighter than web data, which is probably the most popular topic according to our survey results. And it's pretty diversified. But there's a very different state of affairs when you ask people what's working and what's not working. So we asked people what is the most accurate or insightful data set, and over half was concentrated in credit card transactions and web data. And so while funds are trying every data set that they can get their hands on, it's really only a handful of data sets that at this point funds are saying are really insightful and really work in their investment process. And credit card transactions, web data, to a lesser extent, web traffic and email receipt seem to be the clear winners. Conversely, we also asked people what is not working, and those results were pretty concentrated as well. And it seems like funds struggle the most with geolocation and satellite data. So the last topic I want to touch on is spend. And really, we're looking at spend as a concrete measure of true demand for alternative data on the buy side. In this chart, you can see that year over year, spending on alternative data has increased over 50% between 2016 and 2017. However, what's even more compelling is what funds plan to spend on alternative data in the future. By 2018, we estimate the market will grow to 400 million and to over 500 million by 2020. This is an extremely massive ramp in spend. And if you looked at these numbers 2 years ago, forward expectations were even lower. And so we would expect these numbers to grow next year when we do this survey. I imagine the 2020 numbers will become even higher. To break this down a little bit more and give you some more context, we looked at average spend per fund and broke it down into 3 main AUM buckets. So you can see kind of the mega funds relative to the sub $1 billion funds. And yes, spending is very concentrated in large funds. They spend a lot, they have a lot of assets, and so there's economies of scale there. However, what's interesting to me is the the rate of growth amongst the small funds, while the aggregate number is not huge, on a percentage of AUM, those numbers are growing much more rapidly than the greater than $10 billion funds. And so this is pretty interesting. And, you know, depending on where you sit on this chart, you can kind of get a sense for where your firm is relative to the industry average. So with that, I touched on a number of different topics. I want to pause here, open it up for Q&A, pass over to Remy. We've got a lot of analysis on our site, alternativedata.org. We've got a great weekly newsletter that comes out with anecdotes that we hear in the market about alternative data providers, news, jobs, events, and we also publish new data providers that we come across and add them to our database as well. So it's a great resource if you're looking to get focused on alternative data. So with that, I'll turn it over to Remy.
Thanks, Stephen. That was very insightful. I'm going to now go to Joe. Let's hold the Q&A to the end, and everyone, please feel free to ask any questions you have in the questions panel, and we'll get to them at the end. Thanks.
Hi, this is Joe Caserta. Remy, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'll pick up where Stephen left off. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but they were done independently, and we came to the same conclusions. So in this case, I think redundancy, a little bit of redundancy might actually be good. So let's just get right into the presentation. So I'm going to have a slightly different, actually a very different perspective from what Stephen talked about. So we are not a research firm. Everything that I say will be based on practical experience. So we are a consulting firm that specializes in technology and building out data ecosystems. Most recently, a large part of our business has been for alternative data, but we do all things around financial services and other verticals as well. We're an award-winning company, and the foundation of the business is really built on data. And we have strategists, architects, engineers, analysts, and scientists to get an end-to-end solution for your alternative data needs. So what is alternative data? Stephen gave a pretty good definition, but you know, I think more specifically, it's trying to get data that was otherwise invisible to us, just a few years ago. And now we have the capabilities of actually looking at this data, financial transactions of external sources, and the fact that manufacturing facilities actually were producing things, satellites, were taking pictures of cars in parking lots. Like, those cars were always in those parking lots, and those transactions were always happening. But the thing that's different now is that now we have the ability to harness that data and curate that data, collect that data, and analyze that data. And that's really, really special. And that's really what's been changing over the past few years. It's not so much like it's been around and finally we just noticed it and now we're adopting it. Like, this is brand new stuff that has never existed before. And now it exists. And every year or every month, actually, we're seeing more and more alternative data sets become available. We're going to talk a little bit about them and also talk about where to get them if you're interested in getting them. The obvious ones, like Steve was talking about, credit card transactions, customer reviews, things on social media. We'll talk about that as well. So, we can get all this data, but what's the so what of all of this? Like, why do we really care? I think, this is really a different way to think about how we actually do our analysis on our portfolios to figure out what we should be doing with our investments. And, it used to be that you would have humans going out and doing manual research, probably sifting through data. But now, we're having, instead of having like 1 to 10 websites that we can manually look through, we can look through hundreds, multiples of hundreds of websites, millions of Twitter feeds looking for sentiment, or even just mentions. products, of companies, and even, you know, it has FactSet here. So some of the existing companies like Thomson Reuters and S&P, they're all starting to actually add alternative data to their offerings. So alternative data is becoming easier and easier to acquire and get. And then once we get it, you know, now we're starting to see, since the advancement of big data ecosystems, cloud technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, we're starting to very easily be able to implement things like natural language processing to find keywords of companies within all of this data. And, you know, and also not only the data itself, but where is that data coming from? Is it actually graduating from just being in someone's blog to becoming a headline, you know, or at least a PR release, right? And then maybe in a major publication. So we can actually write algorithms to react when we see things that are actually graduating through what we call the media food chain. And really exciting times for data in general, and now with alternative data sources even more so. So here's some facts, right? So you know, there's no doubt that, you know, if we can go through 300 million websites instead of 10, that it is going to become more efficient. It's going to be huge cost savings. But I think Stephen alluded to, I don't think anyone is doing this to save money. They're doing this to make money. So, you know, usually you do your return on investment. A big part of it is cost reduction. We're not really seeing cost reduction in this. We're seeing new capabilities for the business that never existed before, that allows them to generate more money. And that's the primary goal of dealing with alternative data. Getting as much data as possible into machines and running algorithms. It's really becoming common practice in hedge funds. Within our business at Caserta, our alternative data ecosystem business within hedge funds grew about 300% from 17 to 18. So this is real, this is now. And like I said, Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters now include alternative data in their offerings because you just can't deny its value to its customers. And about 75% of hedge funds are already using social media and social-driven news to inform investing decisions. So now, you know, the idea of using alternative data to make more informed decisions, it's not a revelation. It's just what alternative data actually has some value and what doesn't. So some more stats. We have, you know, gorging on alternative data. Hedge funds are planning to spend 74% more money on implementing an alternative data platform. Asset managers are planning to spend 48% more. This is a source from data from Greenwich Associates, rather. And I think this is actually really telling of where the market is going. You know, the idea of having humans making all of the informed decisions about your investments really are yesteryear. And, you know, as you could see by the statistics, without alternative data, you will be left behind. So, you know, with any new technology ecosystem advancement, you know, it would never be complete without an eye chart. So here is our alternative data eye chart. And I just want to point out a few things. Is all of these companies, you know, they wouldn't be in this business if there wasn't something to be done, and if there wasn't money to be made, and if there wasn't opportunity for years to come. But the things that are interesting is the very top swim lane, things like the UBS Evidence Lab and Bank of America Merrill Lynch, like some of the biggest players in the industry are building out alternative data platforms for actually getting data, like the credit card data and the application data. Some of the real popular ones that we're seeing out in the marketplace with our customers, 1010 Data for sure, Quandl for sure, M-Science for sure, basically the whole data broker swim lane. All of those companies are very mature and worth doing business with. Eagle Alpha, probably one of the largest companies in this industry. And then App Annie is also used not only within the tech world, but even the non-tech world, if you're trying to do analytics on any kind of business through through analysis of the usage of their apps, like how many downloads is a company for their own personal application, month over month, quarter over quarter, to see if there is a trend of this company actually getting noticed and growing. So now all of this data is available. What do we do with it? So this fits very, very nicely into what I call the data pyramid that I introduced probably around when Stephen was showing the inflection point of the rise of data, which was around 2009, 2010, where we need to have a couple of different layers of data in order to use it safely and use it efficiently. So we want to have very, very fast speed to value without being bogged down with trying to structure and govern everything to its fullest extent. So we come up with these 4 layers where we're ingesting data in real time, usually through a streaming mechanism, coming into usually an object data store. And then from there, we'll put it into the data lake where we can start enriching that data with reference data like market data, attribution about your companies, about your analysts, whatever information we need in order to empower the data scientists. So as much attribution as we can, and usually includes even more third-party data for reference and attribution. And then once we have everything in the data lake, the data scientists can go have at it and start building their models. So machine learning algorithms are really becoming a commonplace for the analyst world. Data scientists are being added to staff on every one of our clients who are using alternative data 100%. And then ultimately, once they do find insight, then we take the data that's needed throughout the enterprise and we structure it and we put it into the big data warehouse. And this process is what we call the alternative data ecosystem. And this is what it looks like from a technical perspective. So, data sources for your typical financial services business along the left, enriched by some of the companies I mentioned, like Eagle Alpha, FactSet, Quandl, 1010 Data, App Annie, bringing all of that data into some kind of object store. This particular one used S3, but we're actually seeing a big push using Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure or even IBM Cloud. The cloud doesn't matter. What matters is the architecture. So the architecture of building out your ingestion area, building out your data lake. We have 2 tiers of a data lake here where we can start enriching the data and making it look more like what it's going to look like for the structures within the big data warehouse, because a lot of data scientists, they don't really need to have a relational data store. They just need to have data. So once we have the data prepared, we can leave it right in the object data store and they can hit it with their machine learning algorithms using Spark. And then we say the data science workspaces are ephemeral because that means after a certain amount of time, those will spin up and then they'll spin down. And anything that needs to be retained or persisted will be graduated through a rigorous data governance lifecycle back into the data lake or through into the structured data warehouse. You'll notice that we have some functions, could be cloud functions on Google, could be Lambda functions on AWS, could be Hadoop, it doesn't really matter. Again, technology doesn't matter here. But we do want to get things like when we received the data, what the data looked like when we received it, technical statistics about the data to ensure its accuracy and keep all of that in a metadata repository. Typically, we build those ourselves and load those through custom functions. And then on top of all of this, typically we're doing Python, machine learning, by data scientists through a Jupyter notebook. We can also use business intelligence tools on the structured data. In this case, we use Looker. You could use Tableau, Click, whatever flavor you like. And then some kind of data catalog. And the data catalog, could be something like Elation or Calibra. In this case, we use CCAN, which is an open source Python-based data catalog that you can custom build yourself. So the next step, once we have all this data, once we have insight on this data, forward thinking, and in some of our clients, today's thinking, but we want to be able to integrate all of the alternative data with all of our internal data assets. Then we want to start doing machine learning on top of this data to derive insight. And then finally, we want to add some artificial intelligence to the ecosystem so that we can actually start, doing very interesting things like integrating chatbots and actually having the data and the chatbot interact so you can actually speak with your data as a personal assistant. This is actually not, blue sky. This is actually real. This is happening, and there's several APIs out there that you can use. You don't have to build this stuff from scratch, that are offered by third parties. So, when Stephen was talking, a big part of this is talent, finding, he was calling them FTEs, but, finding talent is not easy. There's very, very high demand for this type of talent that can actually get insight out of alternative data and be able to build a data ecosystem to house it. Actually, Caserta has we can help find talent for your in-house staff, and we can also help provide talent that are consultants as well. All of our financial services clients dealing with alternative data are adding data scientists to their staff, and cloud architecture for financial services, as recent as last year was taboo. Now, all of our clients who are dealing with alternative data they're putting the data on the cloud because they want to have the elasticity and the scalability and the speed to value, and all of the other advantages that goes with the cloud. And also, in this case, also reduction of cost, right? Because you really don't know how much data you're going to get or need. We are definitely at an inflection point where we've been playing for the last few years, and now it's very, very serious business. And there's new data sources to be experimented with. And now that if you use the last slide or the reference architecture slide as your laboratory, now you have a clean room where you can very quickly ingest new data sets that you've never experienced before, do very fast analytics on it to see if it actually has any value, and then either continue to productionalize it or throw it away. And I think you can only really do that efficiently on the cloud. Some of the languages we're seeing in this environment is Python, machine learning libraries typically in Python, and of course, when you're dealing with data, you never really get away from SQL. So build skills from existing talent, enrich your team with new talent, and always remember that it's more than technology. Technologists alone probably won't fit the bill to enrich your team. You need someone who's not only a technologist, but someone who can also think like a financial analyst. So goals are, create the alternative data framework, automate all of the mundane tasks, some of which includes embedding data cleansing and data integration with your external data and your internal data. Use the big data ecosystem and embrace change, right? This is going to be probably the most disruptive thing you can do within your environment at work. So, take it very, very seriously. Realize that the people around you are probably not going to embrace it right away. They may feel like their jobs are in jeopardy, But as as Stephen mentioned, no one is, the addition of data, of alternative data, is actually increasing jobs, not decreasing jobs. So I think education within your environment is a very big criteria for proper adoption and success. Leverage consultants. So, hire someone who has at least been there, done that at least once. Learning on the job in this environment can be a very, very expensive business. So hire some people who are experts in the field. And remember that innovations may fail, but build out your clean room, get your data ecosystem ready, and then as you start innovating and experimenting with new data sets, like Stephen was saying, not all of them are successful. The coolest one is probably the satellite data, but as we looked, it's probably one of the least efficient, or the least successful ones. So it's okay, but we have to try it and see if it works. And then if it doesn't, we just dump it. But the key is to do it very, very efficiently, so there's very, very low cost sunk into experimentation. And companies that don't try to innovate will fail in this climate. So that's all I have. Again, I'm Joe Caserta, president of Caserta. My email, joe@caserta.com, Twitter, joe@Caserta. And remember that we are financial services, alternative data strategists, architects, and engineers. And feel free to reach out with any questions if we don't get to your question in this webinar.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to take it now to the Q&A session. We have a few questions that I'd like to share with everyone. Our first one is, how long does it typically take to see value come from alternative data? Joe, do you want to take that one?
I'll take that. I don't know if Stephen has anything more statistically driven, but in my own personal experience, it really depends. If we think back to my slide where I show the reference architecture, if you have the reference architecture built and you have a new alternative data set that you want to derive value from or prove whether it has value or not, it could literally be done in days. But typically the entire ecosystem is not built because it is so new. So that can take anywhere from several weeks to several months. It really depends on your own culture, how far along you are, whether you're ready to embrace the cloud. There's a few different variables to consider. Typically, if you're interested, what Caserta does is before we try to do anything physically, we would come in and do a strategic assessment where we look at what it is you're trying to accomplish, what do you have today, and what would the roadmap to get you to where you need to be look like, and we'll tell you exactly how long it will take.
Okay. Thank you. What is the best way for a discretionary investor to dig deeper into specific sectors or tickers with alternative data? Stephen, you might be better for that one.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So, just kind of riffing off of what Joe was saying, it's obviously a very infrastructure-focused discussion. I think there's a mix of data providers out there in terms of how advanced they are, in terms of whether they just provide the raw data, if they provide any analytics on top of that, or some of the more research-oriented data providers like a Yipit Data or an M-Science, where they're actually providing research. So you're plugging into that a little bit deeper. But to answer your question, I think the best thing that an investor can do is really push the data provider for specific use cases and applications for that data in the sector that they're covering. Often the best data is the best data for a specific sector, and not all data is going to be broadly applicable to every sector within the investing landscape. So really push people on, what are the use cases for that sector? What are the KPIs that you can specifically predict, and push them on mapping those KPIs and benchmarking those KPIs. This is something that we're thinking a lot about within alternativedata.org. We recently launched a series of events that we call briefings that are sector specific and designed to present the best data providers for each sector. We just recently did one for travel, had about 100 investors there, and featured the top travel data sets. We'll also be launching a data provider profile page on our site that will be categorizing everybody into sectors and tickers. But it really gets back to understanding what your needs are and what your questions are that you're looking to answer with data, and really pushing data providers on how that data is applicable.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Next question. Can you elaborate more on Tier 1 and Tier 2 data lake functions and governance?
Sure, I guess that's me. So Tier 1, the data sets within Tier 1 look very, very much like the source data. But we may do things like, if it's a JSON file, we'll write a little Python script that parses the Python and Python parses the JSON and flattens it out into a more normalized structure. Not that it'll be fully structured at all, but at least it'll be flattened out so that data scientists can interrogate it more easily. And also we'll add some metadata to the files as well, just to keep track of them, to know where they are, so that we can apply some information lifecycle management on them. And then also for Tier 2 starts to look dimensional, if you will. So it'll take the existing event data sets that we have and enrich them with dimensionality. So it will add things about the company, things about the products, things about the regions, if there's geospatial information, anything that we can add just to enrich that data, to add attribution. And it starts to look a lot like some of the older school dimensional data models, but only it's in an object data store. And then, moving that out into the data warehouse becomes a fairly trivial task, right? Because the restructuring of the data is already done. There's usually some aggregation done between Tier 1 and Tier 2 as well.
Thanks, Joe. And we're going to take one more question. The question is about 300 million websites are being scraped. How do you get around paywalls and copyright issues? Stephen, would you like that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment on this generally. I think each data provider will have their own kind of internal compliance policies. Some are probably more thoughtful than others on this topic, but that is I think it's a great question, and something that funds should be very focused on, in terms of if you're dealing with a scraping data provider, whether they're accessing paywalls, whether they're creating fake accounts, whether they're trying to crack CAPTCHAs, or explicitly agreeing to or actively agreeing to things, terms of use to access information that's hidden behind those walls. But I can't really comment specifically on this for every individual scraping data provider. But if whoever had that question would like to follow up offline, we can have a conversation about that. I don't know, Joe, if you have any more specific commentary.
Is that the legal aspects around web scraping and alternative data, it's really not clearly defined. Like, there's no laws around it, but there are laws around the terms and conditions associated with the websites that you're crawling. So I think there is some diligence to be done for the actual websites that you're generically, I don't think there's any law, but on a website by website basis, you should read the terms and conditions associated with those websites. Just forward thinking, just because I'm a geek, I would actually think about writing some natural language processing to interrogate the terms and conditions systematically, and figure out if you're able to, with some machine learning, and figure out if you're able to do that before you actually do it. But right now, I don't think there's any. I think that would be a manual one-time task.
Okay, thanks. We're actually going to take one more question before we go. The last question is, what is the biggest challenge or some of the biggest challenges of integrating alternative data into an existing data lake?
I'm sorry, ask that again?
What is the biggest challenge or some of the biggest challenges of integrating alternative data into an existing data lake?
Well, for me, master data is usually a challenge, right? As you know, companies go through M&A transactions, or there's name changes, lining up alternative data with your internal data can be a challenge. So they're usually, if you want to productionalize this in a serious way, there usually is some master data management treatment to your data first as a prerequisite in order for it to actually work.
All right, thank you. That's about it for today. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Stephen. And if you have any further questions, everybody, please feel free to email me, and I will pass them along to Remy, R-E-M as in Michael Y, at Caserta.com. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.